On Halloween night in 2002, a wealthy home in Sao Paulo went silent. No screams, no neighbors rushing to the windows, no sign of struggle that anyone noticed right away. Inside that house, Manfred and Marísia von Richthofen lay dead in their bed, bludgeoned while they slept. And the person who would later guide police through the crime scene, the person who cried in front of cameras, the person who told investigators she had no idea who could have done this, was their daughter. Tonight, we're telling the story of Suzane von Richthofen, a case that shocked Brazil and continues to haunt it. Welcome back, witches and wanderers, to the Morbid Witch Podcast. I'm your host, Kari, and tonight's episode is a heavy one. This is not folklore. This is not myth. This is real. Episode 37 takes us to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and into one of the country's most infamous true crime cases. A story of privilege, manipulation, obsession, and betrayal. This is the murder of Manfred and Marísia von Richthofen, and the daughter who helped plan their deaths. The von Richthofen family lived a life of comfort. Manfred Albert Freyer von Richthofen was a respected engineer. Marísia von Richthofen was a psychiatrist. They were educated, wealthy, and socially prominent. Their children, Suzane Louise von Richthofen, born in 1983, and Andreas Freyer von Richthofen, her younger brother. From the outside, the family appeared stable, loving, and successful. But appearances are often the most dangerous thing to trust. Suzane was described as intelligent, charming, and soft-spoken. She attended a prestigious university. She spoke multiple languages. She came from money and opportunity. But behind that carefully maintained image, people would later describe her as manipulative, emotionally cold, deeply resentful of parental control, and willing to lie convincingly. Suzane wanted independence. She wanted freedom. And most of all, she wanted Daniel Crovignos. Daniel and Christian Crovignos came from a very different background. They were rougher, working class, known for impulsivity and aggression. Daniel Crovignos was Suzane's boyfriend, charismatic, possessive, and deeply resented by her parents. Manfred and Marísia did not approve of the relationship. They believed Daniel was using Suzane, that he was dangerous, that he represented everything they feared losing control over. And in that tension, something dark began to grow. The motive was chillingly simple. Suzane wanted to live with Daniel. Her parents refused. She also stood to inherit a substantial fortune if they were gone. Money, freedom, a life without rules. According to investigators, Suzane didn't just go along with the plan. She helped create it. The plan was methodical. Suzane provided the schedules, access, knowledge of the house, and reassurance that her parents would be asleep. Daniel and Christian would do the killing. They chose blunt force to avoid gunshots or alarms. Suzane's role was not passive. She arranged an alibi. She ensured her brother would be away. And she left the house that night knowing exactly what would happen when she returned. On Halloween night, Suzane left the house with Daniel and Christian. Later, Daniel and Christian returned alone. They entered the parents' bedroom. Manfred and Marísia were asleep. They were beaten to death in their bed. The crime was brutal, personal, unforgiving. The killers left the house, attempting to stage a robbery. Suzane returned home later that night. She discovered the bodies. She screamed. She called the police. In interviews, she appeared devastated, too composed, too controlled. Investigators noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable was taken. Suzane's reaction didn't match the horror of the scene. The cracks began to form. Police focused quickly on Suzane, Daniel Cravinhos, and Christian Cravinhos. The phone records, witness testimony, and contradictory statements. Under pressure, Daniel confessed, then Christian, then Suzane. On November 9th, 2002, just days after the murders, Suzane von Richthofen was arrested. Brazil watched in shock as the image of the grieving daughter collapsed. One of the most tragic figures in this case is Andreas, Suzane's younger brother. He lost both parents, and he lost his sister, not just to prison, but to betrayal. Andreas would later legally sever ties with Suzane, refusing reconciliation. For him, the crime didn't end in 2002. It simply changed shape. The trial captivated Brazil. Suzane's defense attempted to paint her as manipulated by Daniel, as emotionally dependent, as controlled. But prosecutors presented a different picture. A young woman who planned, calculated, and acted with full awareness. The jury agreed. In the end, Suzane von Richthofen was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Daniel Cravinhos was sentenced to 40 years in prison, and Christian Cravinhos was sentenced to 38 years in prison for conspiracy. The sentences reflected not only the brutality of the crime, but the betrayal at its heart. A daughter who orchestrated the murder of her own parents. Brazil was horrified. Suzane became a symbol of greed, moral collapse, manipulation, and the dark side of privilege. The case inspired books, documentaries, and films. And one persistent question: how does someone kill the people who raised them and go to sleep at night? Suzane's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Love can become obsession. Privilege does not equal morality. Intelligence does not prevent cruelty. And some crimes are born not of desperation, but entitlement. This wasn't survival. This was choice. The von Richthofen murders weren't impulsive. They weren't accidental. They weren't misunderstood. They were planned, they were executed, and they were justified, in the minds of the killers, by desire. Suzane wanted a life without limits. What she built instead was a prison, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. Thank you for listening to the Morbid Witch Podcast. True crime like this reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't lurk in the shadows. They sit at dinner tables, smile for photos, and say goodnight. If you want more deep dives into dark history, folklore, and true crime, follow the podcast wherever you listen, and share it with fellow wanderers of the strange. Until next time, stay strange, stay spooky, and remember, the shadows are always watching.